All right, so good afternoon again, and welcome to the first public transitions launch and learn session of the Climate Bonds Initiative. My name is Oluwatoyin Oyekeno, and I manage the Agri-Food Transition Program. And it's my pleasure today to have you here with us. And the topic for today is on transition finance. And precisely, we'll be talking about financial crimes and land conversion, uncovering risk for financial institution and the commodity supply chain. And to do justice to this topic, we have with us three experts from Themis and WWF. We have John Dodsworth from WWF, we have Carel van Randwyck, and we have Olivia Dakeyne. And they will be presenting their report on this topic. We hope you have a good time learning from this session. I will welcome you to ask your questions at the end of the presentation. If you look at your screen at the bottom, you will see a raise hand function. So either you drop your question in the chat box or you use the raise hand function, and we know that you have a question. But without further ado, I will turn over to Carel to kick us off. Thanks, Carel.
Thank you, Toyin. If we could have the slides up. And I believe John will be starting the presentation.
Actually, first, I'm going to sneak in there with a little short quiz to try and invigorate everyone after a morning of potential torpor.
Coming up shortly.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, this is just who we all are. We've got that slide at the end as well before questions for you to mull over. So if we go to the next slide, please, Toyin. So this is just three quick questions to try and kind of raise your awareness of environmental crime before we start to kind of get you invigorated for the session. So we're not trying to do a slide or anything where there could be tech issues. So it's just really for you to kind of mull over and think about. But for you to think about, where do you think environmental crime ranks in terms of global financial crime? So this is in terms of kind of revenue generated. Do you think it's the 4th largest, the 7th largest, or the 10th largest worldwide? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to think about it. And let you know that it's the 4th largest worldwide. So this comes after arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, and human trafficking, but hopefully really shows you the scale of that and those sort of really organized crime activities. Environmental crime is very, very much one of those now. So what do you think is the annual growth rate of environmental crime? Do you think it's 2 to 3%, it's 3 to 5%, or it is 5 to 7%? And obviously, because I'm trying to shock you, it is the biggest number. It is 5 to 7%. So this is according to Interpol. And this growth rate outstrips the growth rate of the illicit economy by 2 to 3 times. So it's growing 2 to 3 times faster than the kind of legitimate economy is growing worldwide. So quite a shocking statistic there. And our last question: what percentage of non-state armed groups and militia income worldwide is funded by environmental crime? So where do these individuals get their funding from, to kind of what extent? So is it about 10%, is it about 40%, or is it about 50%? And it's about 40%. So it's 38% according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So it's the single largest source of financing for non-state armed groups and militias over the world. So it accounts for 38% of their income. So a really hefty portion, over a third, almost half of it comes from revenue generated from environmental crime. And this is used to kind of sustain engagement in conflict and all their violent activities worldwide. So it's really not it has a lot of real world impacts. Environmental crime, it isn't just a sort of closed thing that happens in a vacuum, happens deep in the forest somewhere, as you'll find out more during this presentation. But I will hand over now to John to talk to you more about the kind of context of our project before we get into the meat of our research.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Olivia, and thanks very much everyone for taking the time to join today. So what I wanted to cover, just sort of in terms of more of a framing as to why we're looking at environmental crime and the evolution of WWF's work on this topic, and also the collaboration with Themis, is what we recognized is when we looked beyond just the illegal wildlife trade and we started to look at the financial flows connected to more broadly environmental crime. As Olivia's already mentioned, it's classified as the fourth largest globally. And within that, when we look at something such as illegal logging, Interpol estimates that illegal logging alone is worth $152 billion per year. And when we look at then a topic or a sector such as mining and the illicit side of mining, we're looking at a figure which is way beyond that $150 billion mark. Now, with WWF's work covering countries and covering 100 different countries, one of the things we saw clearly was the convergence between predicate offences, so more broadly traditional financial crime, and also environmental crime. And I think the key message to leave you all with today is the fact that this can no longer be seen as purely a conservation issue, because of those connections, and not just dotted lines, but actually clear flows and links to financial institutions, but also key to the risk of the integrity of financial markets. And if we can go on to the next slide, please. Based on the International Chamber of Commerce Trade Finance report from 2020, the trade finance market is worth $5 trillion annually. And one of the key aspects that we've recognized is the intersection between trade-based finance and also trade-based money laundering connecting to environmental crime. And Olivia has mentioned already that the growing rate of environmental crime, but crucially from our own research, but also the work of the Financial Action Task Force and also the UN agencies and World Bank, there is a clear disparity now between the growth of environmental crime and the risk, and the significant proceeds involved. Yet the focus on environmental crime and relevant risk assessments and financial investigations has been limited. And that is also aligned to the Financial Action Task Force survey when they interviewed respondent countries, and over 20 had not considered environmental crime in their national or sectoral money laundering risk assessments. With the emergence of climate finance and climate mitigation finance, we know that the uplift needed to meet that is going to be in the trillions of dollars. When we recognize that these country and sectoral risk assessments are not in place, and also from the report we released in April, the convergence between environmental crime and financial crime, the risk both to financial institutions but also to the integrity of markets is significant. Next slide, please. So one of the key things we recognized, and this very much builds on the recommendations that came from the Financial Action Task Force reports from 2020 and 2021, were the importance of targeted information that can be acted on not just by financial institutions, but also asset managers and asset owners, as well as national law enforcement and financial intelligence units, was access to information on the scope, scale, and risk that environmental crime poses, whether that be at a sector level or a country level, and also raising awareness on the typologies and also red flags or risk assessments that are necessary in a way that 20 years ago, a topic such as human trafficking was not well understood or integrated into financial institutions' risk assessments, and now it's commonplace. There is a need to raise awareness and build out the typologies of the convergence of financial crimes and human rights abuses linked to environmental crimes. And one of the insights we received recently in a workshop in Hong Kong was the point that risk controls at the moment on these topics are blunt and they need to be sharpened. And this is an initiative which seeks to sharpen those controls. In the short to medium term, the aim is very much to move the financial sector's approach to environmental crime and then to see the necessary risk controls updated. At the moment, environmental crime is very much not viewed within those parameters of serious organised crime, and as a result, that has a knock-on effect for resource allocation in terms of the level of seriousness, and also even from a guidance perspective for national regulators in terms of how they look at this topic to provide support to the financial sector as a whole. And in the medium term, the hope is by developing the typologies, the threat indicators, it will be able to support financial institutions and more broadly the financial sector develop clear risk mitigation strategies and controls to support the promotion of more ambitious policies on this topic. Next slide, please. So our view on this work, and it builds on work we undertook back in 2020, again with Themis and the UK government on the illegal wildlife trade financial toolkit. And the key was to broaden the scope, the scale, and the sectors to be able to look more broadly and to also deepen the work on the illegal wildlife trade. But we recognised, as already mentioned, the importance of developing a greater understanding and awareness of that convergence between financial crime and human rights abuses, as well as other predicate offences. And the development of this practical resource would allow for key components of it to actually be lifted and integrated into existing financial systems. So very much looking at a plug-in and play model, whether that be word searches, whether that be the integration of particular typologies, and with the ability to use this very much as a central repository for risk and compliance teams, financial investigators, but also potentially for relationship managers or for the investor arms of financial institutions as well, with the longer term ambition that this can support the incorporating of these risk types and typologies into existing financial crime and ESG frameworks and building a company-wide approach to tackling these risks sector by sector. As one of the key things that we recognized was ultimately when we look at the different SDGs, every single one of these SDGs is undermined by the prevalence of environmental crime. Next slide, please. So in terms of the functions of the toolkit, and again, I would encourage you, if you have any further questions on this, to reach out afterwards and we can share you the different links. But and Olivia will go into this in more detail, particularly on the introductory report, was the release of that report in April was very much sort of the starting, our sort of starting gambit to be able to explain that convergence between financial crime and deforestation and land conversion, and very clearly to articulate the global nature of the issue, but also the prevalence of large-scale funding in different shapes and forms into these deforestation and land conversion activities. And the aim very much is to build on the guidance from the Financial Action Task Force, the G7's announcements, as well as the EU due diligence legislation, is on actually capturing how this is prevalent and how this actually is risking integrity of financial markets. The second part of it is very much on the guidance element and providing that information sector by sector, including a country risk assessment tool, identifying where those predicate offences cross-cut with particular sectors, but also underlining the fact of or clarifying the ambiguity between legal and illegal deforestation, and being able to provide and support guidance on the risk assessment templates, particularly where progress has been made, for instance, on the illegal wildlife trade, and also building on examples, for instance, of where very recently the Financial Conduct Authority in Singapore has issued a guidance document on environmental crime and money laundering. And last but not least, a development or a compendium of red flags, particularly with keyword searches to help screen customers review data, whether that be know your customer on an onboarding basis or an annual review basis, with the ability to sort of support that and strengthen that with testimonies and guidance as well. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, this very much does build on work that's gone before. So we're not looking to reinvent the wheel, but with this in a format that's one, accessible, and also does speak to the financial sectors, or speaks a language the financial sector can understand, with an ambition and with the report so far. The report's been translated or is being translated into 7 different languages, and we hope to have an interface that will also include different translations of key sections, so that very much one of the ambitions of this work is that it does not just land with UK and North American and European financial institutions, but we seek to internationalize it to key regions and markets where deforestation and land conversion and more broadly environmental crime is much more of a risk and concern. Next slide, please. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand across.
John, many thanks for that introduction and setting the scene. So why should a financial institution care about deforestation and land conversion? Over the next couple of slides, I will go into the direct and indirect, let's say, links that financial services firms have, and also what the potential risks to their businesses could be for being involved in providing finance, insurance, and investing in companies and or sovereigns that are exposed to deforestation and land conversion. In the report, we deal with the exposures as they relate to commodity production, and we focus on a key set of high-risk commodities that are cattle, soy, palm oil, timber, cocoa, coffee, rubber, minerals, oil and gas, i.e. many of the commodities that are covered by the EU's deforestation regulation, which I'll come on to later. So direct exposure for financial institutions comes through, firstly, financing. So if you're a bank providing debt or equity services, so that could be in the form of trade finance, working capital facilities, revolving credit facilities, payment services, etc., or even insurance to the shipment of commodities that are sourced from the areas of deforestation and land conversion, as well as the assets that are used in those areas to produce those different products. The indirect exposure can come in various forms. Also, looking at it from the banking sector, it could be lending through to third parties, correspondent banking, enabling funds related to commodities sourced from deforested lands to flow through the bank systems, particularly when it comes to SMEs. And from an asset management perspective, investing in companies that produce materials, plant and machinery to enable deforestation and land conversion, as well as the processing of commodities sourced from deforested or converted land, such as palm oil processing machinery, storage facilities, transportation. Looking at it from a capital markets perspective, book runners and or managers of primary debt issuance for sovereigns and corporates could well be indirectly associated with deforestation and land conversion. I'll now look at the different types of deforestation and land conversion risks faced by financial institutions. And as you can see here, they are regulatory risk, transition risk, reputational risk, and operational risk. Looking firstly at the regulatory risk, I'll focus on 2 EU regulations, one being the EU's deforestation regulation, and secondly, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. From a UK perspective, I'll be looking at the Environment Act and the Financial Services and Markets Bill. Firstly, the EU's deforestation regulation. This is a mandatory due diligence on supply chains for businesses operating in the EU to ensure that the products sold in the EU have not led to deforestation or forest degradation. Although no commodity or source of country is banned, any company looking to sell products into the EU will need the supplier of the product to issue a due diligence statement confirming that the product does not come from deforested land. It applies to those products sourced from these countries, such as cattle products, soy, coffee, cocoa, palm, timber, and rubber, and all their derivative products. So quite wide-reaching and broad. It targets both illegal and legal land conversion, and in particular, financial institutions, particularly those supporting the companies that provide these products into the EU, are required to undertake and demonstrate adequate due diligence, risk assessment, and mitigation prior to providing financial services to customers whose economic activities involve trading or placing relevant commodities and products on the EU market. Financial services firms will need to satisfy themselves that there is no more than a negligible risk that the financial services they provide support directly or indirectly to activities leading to deforestation, forest degradation, or forest conversion. Looking at the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, otherwise known as the CSDD, this went through a number of challenging moments in the EU Parliament over the last year and only recently got approved. However, financial institutions are currently excluded from the requirement. However, the EU Parliament is likely in 2025 to revisit that and consider whether financial institutions should also be impacted, or at least ensure that their clients have conducted the necessary due diligence to ensure that none of their products, whether directly or as part of components in their products, are sourced from deforested land. Looking at the UK's Environment Act, it is illegal for businesses operating in the UK to use forest risk commodities that have been grown on land that is illegally occupied or used. This bill was followed up with an environmental improvement plan last year, shifting to more sustainable supply chains to combat deforestation, and businesses that are in scope will be required to undertake a due diligence exercise on their supply chains and to publicly report on this exercise every year. In the Financial Services and Markets Bill, financial institutions are required to implement a due diligence regime to ensure that their activities, both direct and indirect, do not support deforestation or land conversion and are compliant with relevant local laws. All of these legislations and regulation will encounter transition risk. Could you go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. And from personal experience, it is well worthwhile looking at the implications of all of these regulations and the legislation to understand the implications and to plan ahead to ensure that the necessary processes, systems, and reporting is implemented to address these various directives and regulations. From a reputational risk perspective, who wants to have their names on the front page of a broadsheet or any other newspaper, let alone highlighted in news broadcasts or even in investigative documentaries where an organization could be implicated as having provided financing for deforestation or land conversion. And then finally, from an operational risk perspective, most businesses and commercial services depend on natural capital and resources, either directly or through their supply chains. Aggressive consumption of local resources reduces their availability in the long term, undermining sustainable development and creating economic instability. The World Economic Forum actually estimates that at least 50% of global GDP is reliant on nature. The loss of natural resources can therefore decrease the long-term productivity and resilience of businesses that depend on these ecosystems, impacting on the financial institutions that support them. I'll now hand over to Olivia.
Thanks, Carel. So I'm just going to try and very, very briefly cover some of the research that we did in the first stage of our project. So as John mentioned, it was a report and it was very focused on deforestation and land conversion as a subset of environmental crime, because I think a lot of the research in it is very interesting, and other people's backgrounds have a QR code to that full report if you'd like to read it in more detail. So one of the kind of main thrust of our report really is to talk about land conversion more widely rather than just deforestation. It might not be a term that everyone's familiar with. Deforestation, I'm sure you've all heard of, really sort of focuses on forest loss. It's a subtype really of land conversion, which is a more umbrella term, and it refers to sort of what it says on the tin. It's a change in land use. But that includes all sorts of ecosystems, so not just forests. It also includes things like grassland and peatland, mangrove swamps, kind of savanna, marshland, lots of different biomes. And it also includes where more trees have been planted. So you might think if you're cutting down 100 trees and then you're planting another 100 trees, that's okay, there's still 100 trees. But land conversion sort of takes into account the fact that you're not replacing like with like. If you're cutting down 100 trees from primary forest, where those trees have had sort of hundreds of thousands of years to mature, they're absorbing a lot of carbon, there are different species, they're part of a sort of really diverse biome, and then you're replacing it with a monoculture sort of culture plantation, so 100 soy trees or palm trees or rubber trees or something like that. Not only is it probably not absorbing as much carbon because they're young trees, they're little baby trees, but the biodiversity has fundamentally been changed. The species composition has changed. So you're changing that ecosystem fundamentally, and that has a really wide impact. So that's one of the main kind of messages in our report, that companies and people should look beyond just deforestation to a wider definition of land conversion, because you're taking into account a much wider array of really, really important ecosystems. And why is it important? She's staying back on that slide, sorry. Why is it important? What are the impacts of land conversion? So as I mentioned, sort of carbon sinks, so trees absorb carbon. When you cut them down, they're not having that effect. Often they're then burnt, the land is cleared with fires, that releases that carbon into the atmosphere. So there are now areas of the Amazon, for example, that actually are net emitters of carbon rather than kind of net absorbers, which is really really detrimental kind of globally, not just locally. So it's thought that as much of as 20% of global carbon emissions can be accounted for by land conversion and land use change. And then biodiversity loss, as I mentioned, so 69% of the world's wildlife, it's thought, has been lost since 1970. And the majority of this is from these land conversion and deforestation hotspots. And scientists have kind of warned that we're in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. So it has a huge, huge impact there. Climate change obviously has an impact on kind of weather events. So, natural disasters and things like that worldwide. But what's even worse is that, when you're cutting down trees act as these sort of really important buffer zones for extreme weather. So they kind of act as windbreaks, they act as kind of water breaks. So if you think about rain falling on land that's sort of been deforested, it's all kind of dry, it's arid, it sort of runs right off. There's a really increased risk of flooding. If you've got trees in the way, some will land on the leaves, some will land on the trunk, and it'll sort of drip down slowly, so it's reaching the soil at a varied rate. So they really break up kind of water, how water hits the earth as well, which is really, really important for kind of communities that are vulnerable to flooding. And this doesn't just affect those local communities, because you go and get climate refugees as a result of this. So this is actually a really important driver of the kind of south to north human migration pattern as well. So it isn't just affecting those local communities where it's happening, it's affecting all the other areas of the world where these kind of climate refugees then need to relocate to as well. It also really sort of feeds into and supports crime. So both on a kind of petty local scale, if you're depriving local communities of their main source of income, or you know, kind of medicine, food, livelihood. A lot of indigenous communities really kind of rely on the forest for that, for sort of sustenance and their livelihoods. If you're removing that, a lot of people have to turn to kind of petty crime and violence to sustain themselves, or they get sort of sucked into these organized crime gangs for much needed income. Sort of increased rates of murders of environmental kind of defenders, so activists as well, are really observed linked to this kind of deforestation activity. It's the 2-year anniversary this week of the murder of John Phillips, the journalist, and Bruna Pereira in the Amazon. Sort of that was linked to kind of serious organised crime activity and kind of illegal fishing activity there, and deforestation sort of stuff feeds into that. So a lot of violence as well. And this kind of serious organised crime involvement has an impact, again, not just in those areas where it's happening, but internationally, because it drives up, you know, driving up the crime rates. It feeds the shadow economy that really undermines the sort of illicit economy. It deprives governments of tax revenue worldwide. It feeds into this web of kind of further crime and violence. It really supports these burgeoning sort of illegal networks, and that ultimately does undermine national security and kind of international security as well, because you're feeding and strengthening these networks, supporting and kind of financing them. So yeah, really important on a global scale as well as a local scale. Next slide, please. So the other main thrust of our report was that land conversion can itself be legal or illegal, but it's a very grey area, and I don't have time to go into all the detail here of why, but go into it much more in our report if you are interested. There are a lot of grey areas, a lot of different sort of bits of national legislation that kind of contribute to that. But what we're sort of saying is that whether or not it's legal or illegal, there is a really heavy convergence with other serious crimes. And therefore that it almost shouldn't, it's not that it's unimportant, but that almost shouldn't be the main factor that you're looking at, because actually illegal activity is very, very likely to be there, even when land conversion is kind of ostensibly legal. So as far back as 2016, the United Nations actually noted, along with Interpol, that 84% of countries saw a convergence between environmental crime and other serious organised crime. So that's a really, really hefty crossover there. And this happens, as you can see on this slide, in a variety of ways. We go into a lot more kind of details, a lot more examples in our report, but serious organised crime, sorry, is a really big one. So the war on drugs really sort of drove these cartels deeper into the forest. They were kind of hiding, they were looking around, they were seeing what other resources were sort of there at their disposal. There's a lot of kind of gold in the Amazon. So a lot of illegal gold mining takes place. A lot of drug cartels are sort of diversified into that. Obviously loads of trees, so illegal logging, illegal timber. It's kind of enabled these sort of drug cartels, primarily drug cartels, but sort of serious organised crime cartels, arms traffickers as well, to really diversify their kind of income streams and into these other illicit activities. And that really feeds into this this thing called narco deforestation. So that's deforestation that's kind of related to drugs production. And that happens in a variety of ways. It can happen because you are just clearing the land to produce drugs. So that happens for kind of for coca, for cocaine, for poppies, for kind of heroin, and opium, also for marijuana. So all sorts of drugs, you need to clear the land to kind of plant and produce them. It also is in the sense that you need to then transport these drugs out of those areas where you produce them. So you then, if you're in really, really dense forests, you need to clear that land to create kind of makeshift airstrips and roads and river ports and things like that. So that sort of ad hoc kind of informal infrastructure is a really leading cause of land conversion and deforestation. Also in terms of money laundering, so a lot of traffickers, they kind of buy up or they grab land. They then invest the profits of the drugs into it so they can launder it through. So there's a lot of kind of agricultural production that crosses over here. Narco cattle ranching is a big one. These sort of big cattle ranches that have kind of sprung up in around South America. soy and palm oil plantations as well. You've probably heard of blood avocados from kind of Mexican drug cartels. So there's that aspect to it. In terms of terrorist financing and conflict financing, it happens again in a variety of ways, but one really good example is Al-Shabaab in Somalia. The bulk of their income comes through the sort of informal taxation of Somalian charcoal, which is a product of illegal deforestation. And that's actually a really sought after sort of luxury item for grilling meat in the Middle East. So they get millions of dollars every year in income through that kind of deforestation activity. Corruption and bribery, I think that's quite obvious, underpins a lot of it in terms of, procuring permits, bribing kind of border officials and everyone to turn a blind eye to it. We have a really interesting case study in our report about a Peruvian mayor who's actually the head of a timber laundering mafia as well. So using his kind of power for influence in that way. Fraud, sort of fraudulent permits, kind of tweaking customs documents and stuff as well. Cybercrime, to hack into databases to procure these permits. And as I said, money laundering, all of the kind of illegal profits that come from this activity are then going to be laundered, most of them going to be laundered through that global financial system as well. Tax evasion is a really interesting one. So not just in terms of the profits of sort of illegal land conversion activity, making their way into tax havens and sort of high secrecy havens, but also there's a really interesting study that found that the majority, so about 3/4, it was 68% of foreign capital that was flowing into 9 of the top 10 companies in the kind of soy and beef sectors in the Brazilian Amazon was actually coming through tax havens, a lot of it through the Cayman Islands. This is between 2000 and 2011. So it's actually sort of the profits of tax evasion are actually funding this activity as well. It's a kind of a bi-directional relationship, which is quite interesting. Human trafficking. So it's thought that about 40% of deforestation worldwide is undertaken by victims of forced labor, obviously through no fault of their own. And that's also really heavily utilized in things like mining and kind of logging and agriculture and charcoal production. So these activities that require land clearing as well. And then the illegal wildlife trade. So there's a kind of opportunistic element here. If you're creating the infrastructure to penetrate these kind of forest dense areas, you're giving poachers like a readier access to this exotic wildlife. So there's opportunistic poaching that happens. There's also a high crossover between sort of timber and logging companies acting as fronts for illegal wildlife trafficking. There have been instances of kind of smuggled shipments of flora and fauna being found inside hollowed out logs and things like that. So there's a high crossover with a whole array of kind of predicate crimes, which means that it's something that you should really, really consider high risk, whether or not you think the land conversion activity is itself legal or illegal. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to skip through, I think, the next 2 in the interest of time. Yeah, so just very, very quickly, because I know we need time for questions on the sort of original sort of research that we did. So we did a lot of desk-based research. We also did a survey with 644 financial professionals from across the world, and these were across sort of source and destination and transit countries for the products that are linked to kind of deforestation and land conversion. And if you go into the next slide, did some focus groups as well, got a lot of really interesting feedback from there, both in London and in Hong Kong. And we found this kind of array of challenges that you can see on screen there. So a lot around the kind of supply chain complexity, lack of data sharing, both sort of transnationally and sort of within countries. So for example, GDPR, data protection regulation being an issue there, a lack of regulatory pressure that's, starting to change, but both from governments and kind of financial intelligence units. But really sort of crucially, we found a lot of procedural gaps that really lead to a vulnerability in the sector. So we found that about half of financial institutions that we surveyed were operating in high risk sectors or geographies, and yet over a quarter of them aren't undertaking specific due diligence that's related to that. We found that between a fifth and a third of survey respondents had said that their firms had borne witness to parties that were attempting to hide financial crime that was linked to land conversion by different tactics as well. So that's quite a lot. And we also found that sort of very few, about 16% of people were monitoring and screening companies on a periodic and ongoing basis rather than just when they were onboarding, which obviously creates a lot of vulnerability there. But the good news, to kind of end on a good news story, is that about 50% of them, so half, indicated a willingness to end business relationships on the strength of concerns around land conversion linked crime. So that kind of suggested to us that really emphasising the risk exposure and providing, you know, this toolkit that has these practical resources could really help with that, and could actually be a really kind of meaningful action that helps companies to reduce their exposure and generally sort of undermines the financing to this activity. So Toyin, I know that we are quite tight on time. I think John wanted to very quickly sum up our kind of going forward plans. Do we have time for that? I think we could drop it if there isn't time. We want to go straight into questions.
Perfect. I'll do it just but with 1 minute to spare. So what I just wanted to clearly sort of articulate was for what we've achieved so far, and it's a combination of what Carel and Olivia have already mentioned and I've gone into briefly, but also the plans for 2024. And I think there have been a number of questions that have come in the chat in terms of potential sort of areas of connection. And one of the things I would urge anyone on the call is please don't hesitate to get in contact, particularly if you see opportunities to collaborate going forward. But we kicked off this this wider initiative back in August of last year, and have worked with the Financial Services Task Force, which is part of the Sustainable Markets Initiative, Zero Deforestation Working Group with the financial institutions, and took their feedback on board from October with a workshop we hosted around the scope and scale, but particularly what those challenges are relating to financial institutions' ability to screen risk, and also even acknowledge and understand the risks that we've outlined in today's presentation. Now, Olivia's gone into detail, into brief detail on the financial crimes and land conversion report. I'd urge anyone on the call to sort of access that with the QR codes, as it very much, for the first time in our opinion, is it clearly articulates that convergence between financial crime and environmental crime, and highlights the risk and the global risk. And last but not least, we hosted workshops last year, and so far this year have hosted a workshop in London with financial institutions, and again in Hong Kong. And we'll be planning a number of further outreach sessions with FIs and more broadly the financial sector, to test the functionality of key components of what we're developing, but also to ensure that it connects with other initiatives, and also to make sure that we bring the right stakeholders together, because it's not just about engaging financial institutions, but cognizant of the fact that we also need to speak to regulators and cross-national bodies as well on this topic. So to uplift this so that it can no longer be seen as just a conservation issue, but it can be seen as serious organised crime, and with that improve and enhance the resource allocation to ensure that we can address the bad actors in financial systems. But I will close up there and look forward to hearing any questions.
Right, thank you very much, John, and many thanks, Olivia and Carel, for that detailed presentation. We have a couple of questions already in the chat, and I wonder if we want to take that first. There's a question around PESTEL, GDP country. It seems our job is to measure risk versus reward. Who wants to take that on? So the question here is, how do we address the large MNC's ability to do inversion to seek the lower tax regime versus their financial obligations to the rest of the community of global stakeholders? This is from Aaron on LinkedIn.
That's quite broad brush. Although this isn't an area of my expertise, I'll try to give it a go between risk and reward, especially that bit. I think from a risk perspective, I've outlined what a number of the risks are to businesses, particularly if they're looking to do business in the EU and the UK. The reward side comes from one is avoiding penalties of any sort, but also standing out as a leader in a particular sector to which high quality suppliers want to provide products and services, but also consumers and customers will want to go to ensure that the products that they're buying from particular organizations, and particularly the multinationals, have had sufficient and detailed due diligence on the sourcing of the products that they're buying. I don't know,
Right.
John, if you've got any other
Yeah,
views.
just to add, I think on this piece on the piece on large multinational corporations' ability to inverse tax. One of the things in terms of research that's been done so far is clearly that in key commodity sectors, tax is not being adequately paid, whether that be the timber sector or the palm oil sector. But that falls potentially out of scope of the discussion for today. But what I would clearly say on that is not just for responsibility of financial institutions. That is around the jurisdictional approach, particularly to tax. And that is, relating to tax loopholes and beneficial ownership and how that's done. Transfer pricing, in theory, is legal. And so I think that falls slightly out of scope for today's discussion, but happy to pick up on it. I've just seen a question come in, which was around the articulation of why, or can we elaborate on why environmental crime is considered the fourth most profitable? And maybe I can just quickly pick up on that, because it's one I think we briefly touched on in the presentation. So environmental crime, for the benefit of today's discussion, is covering illegal logging, illegal mining, and illegal wildlife trade, and also illegal and unregulated fishing. And so with that combination and the estimates that have been developed in the Interpol report from 2017, if you combine those illicit financial flows globally, it equates to the fourth largest flow of illicit finance. And as Olivia mentioned, the sort of the hierarchy in which it sits. So hopefully that answers that question.
All right, thank you very much, John. There is another question, I think, from India, my colleague on LinkedIn, and she's asking about how does the Environmental Financial Crimes Toolkit intend to change the financial sector's approach to environmental crime and risk controls? What are the tangibles benefit for FIs?
I'm happy to make a start on it, just because it's very fresh, because we had this discussion in Hong Kong, and Olivia, please feel free to jump in, and Carel as well. And I think this also speaks to another question that's come in terms of the growth rate of environmental crime in contrast to the global growth rate of the global economy, and what implications does that have for financial institutions. So at a macro level, risk controls relating to environmental crimes and their convergence with financial crimes are currently not well articulated or are embedded within financial institutions. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but one of the key things is, at a financial regulator level, this topic is not being clearly prioritized. And there are a number of reasons for that. But without that prioritization at a national or regional level, the ability for financial institutions independently to be able to prioritize this and allocate resource, whether that be staffing, whether that be time, over the number of other competing areas relating to financial crime they have to deal with, is significant. So our hope and ambition with this work, and the feedback we've received so far, is by developing this set of typologies, this guidance, and these risk indicators, we can support financial institutions integrate this information into existing risk controls, to update them, to better screen and provoke questions from a screening perspective relating to clients, relating to transactions, and also relating to correspondent banking relationships as well. Whereas at the moment, there's an absence of this information available in one space. Our ambition is that this starts to bring us together. And the tangible for this is to better mitigate risk. it won't absolve risk, but it's to better mitigate. And that very much builds on the analysis by the UNODC and the Financial Action Task Force, but at the moment there is an absence of prioritization, and the aim and ambition is to ultimately support and strengthen internal risk controls, which will in the medium term help support more ambitious policies within the banks.
Thanks, John. There's another interesting question in the chat. It's something to do about the Indonesian government moving the capital city from Java to Borno. And this anonymous attendee would like to know if this is a crime, because they must do some land conversion and deforestation for this. Any ideas?
It's a good question, and I think and Carel and Olivia have touched on it. This definition between legal and illegal, and ultimately where that stands with relation to national land use plans and where that sits. So I think it's all down to that. I would just say, and I can see another question that's just come in on, will managing environmental crime reduce climate change? Well, our view on this is forests and climate change are interconnected. And so our last three, our three remaining forests, whether that be the Amazon, the Congo Basin, or the New Guinea forest range, in each of those cases, the connection between irrecoverable carbon, peatland, and standing forests and their connection to climate change is significant. And as we know, large-scale agriculture is the primary driver of deforestation and land conversion. Our ability to look at environmental crime, because in some cases, Chatham House estimates that in some cases, 90% of logging in countries is considered illegal. The connection to climate change and addressing environmental crime is clear.
Thanks, John. Before I call on Olivia and Carel for closing remarks, Rachel, would you want to say a word or two on climate bonds, agri-food transitions criteria on deforestation and conversion free?
Oh, thank you, Toyin. Nice to have the opportunity, and thank you, John and Carel and Olivia, for a fantastic presentation. It really took me back to my days working on counter wildlife trafficking, and I'm so pleased to see that the links between environmental crime and financial risks are being brought out, because in my role here at Climate Bonds, we're very keen that investors are supported to avoid those financial risks and identify those investments that are green and can support the transition to a 1.5 degree aligned economy. So while I was listening to what you were saying and all the requirements around due diligence that you were talking about, I was reminded, and thank you for the prompt, Toyin, that we have the deforestation and conversion free criteria here, and it's a set of measures that probably complements very well your toolkit that you're working on there, designed to support companies understand how to implement the due diligence required to avoid conversion commodities associated with deforestation and converted land, as well as allow them to get the certification that they can demonstrate to investors that this is a safe company to invest in, because they are committed to avoiding deforestation and conversion across all of their supply chains. So I think it's a really good complement to the work that you've been doing at Themis and WWF. And I think it's a fantastic synergy to end our panel on. So I'd love to take this offline with you guys and have a further chat about how we can work on that. But that's it from me. And I'll hand back to Toyin to close this off. But thank you again so much. It's been really interesting. And I've been sat in the background very quietly listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Rachel. Carel, any last?
Firstly, thank you very much to the Climate Bonds Initiative for giving us this opportunity to present the results of the research report, as well as highlight the plans for the coming year with the risk assessment toolkit. But I would like to say from a financial services perspective, it's so important to fully understand their direct as well as indirect exposure to deforestation and land conversion, really understand their customers and how the financing services are being used to potentially cut down forests or change the land use of forested areas. As John said, we've only really got 3 major forested areas in the world: the Amazon, the Congo, and Southeast Asia. And there is a link between climate change and deforestation. So we really need to preserve those. And finally, the risks from changes in regulation and legislation. Be aware of those, be prepared, and make sure that you don't get caught out.
Thanks, Carel. Rapid fire round. John, 1 second closing.
I think I'd end on a couple of takeaways. The first is, I think this point that we've raised, that it can no longer be seen as purely a conservation issue, to the points Carel and Olivia have raised. And I think the ambition from our perspective is the need to internationalize this work. The survey that was undertaken by Themis for the report, it was very, very clear that there is a need to engage regional financial institutions and to internationalize this work, because we will not be able to address large flows of this finance if we do not engage for regional banks, for regional regulators in key jurisdictions. And so I think that for us in the next 12 to 18 months is one of the big tasks, and would welcome any thoughts, suggestions, or proposals on how we can collectively do that, because it will be key to bring those stakeholders to the table and to engage on this topic, because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to tackle this problem.
All right, thanks, John. Olivia?
Thank you. Yeah, I would just echo all of that, that it's just, even if you don't care about deforestation from a sort of cutting down trees point of view, there are so many international issues that have been detrimentally affected by it. So really, really important to do that. And financial institutions have such an important role to play. And I would just say, I really encourage people, obviously I would, because I wrote it and my blood, sweat and tears are into it, but to read the report, because everything that we've touched on is there in so much more detail. And just to be put off, it does say 120 pages, but it's a lot of pictures and a lot of appendices as well. So it really isn't that long. You can skim, you can go to different sections, and I think there's a lot more interesting content in there that will go into much more detail of what we've done today.
Thanks, Olivia. So QR code, scan the report. Thanks for joining us. Next month is another interesting topic, again on transition finance. So see you same time next month. Bye, everybody.
Thanks all.